I would recommend is that you call us long before you get in trouble. A good contract is a roadmap for your project, or that thing everyone was hoping wouldn't happen occurs, and now everyone's pointing fingers at everyone. Definitely, I know lawyers aren't everyone's favorite people.
Welcome to the BIM Student Podcast. In this podcast, we talk to leaders, followers, innovators, and adopters from our AEC industry. Like a student, I ask questions that we all wanted to ask on our digital transformation journey, but never actually did. I explore concept, products, ideas, and future possibilities in digital transformation space. Each week, I meet with an amazing guest from the industry. I look forward to learn something new, share new experiences, thoughts, and opinions, and how to make BIM journey better for everybody across the board.
In today's episode, I will be talking to Annik. Annik is a partner at McMillan LLP whose practice is focused on construction, infrastructure, and development industries. A practicing engineer before becoming a lawyer, Annik acts for all industry stakeholders including general contractors, owners, and architects. I will be talking to Annik about how getting BIM involved has changed the language of project contracts and what kind of risks are we exposed to when using incomplete or ambiguous contract language related to technology and data ownership. Welcome to my podcast, Annik. I'm so glad we're doing this. It's first time I have somebody from the law side of things, and I'm glad you're here.
I'm very excited to be here too.
Yes. And how's everything been since we're all going towards the post-pandemic era? How's everything with you?
Everything's very good. It's extremely busy. I think, when the pandemic started, we didn't know what to expect, stop work orders and everything else affecting the industry. But, it's been busy ever since, or ever since it was still busy, but it's been extremely busy and it really hasn't stopped, which is a great thing. It just means that the industry is still going strong, which is a good thing to see. And, I think we're not expecting that to change as construction and infrastructure are going to be key parts of getting the economy going again as we come out of the pandemic and seek to kind of, get the economy going again, get people working and continue to build all of the things that we need to live and grow.
Great. And, the people we just straight away went into our discussion. I didn't even introduce you to the people who would be listening. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who is Annik?
So I am a partner at McMillan LLP in our construction and development group. My practice really focuses on the front end of the construction in terms of helping clients get development approvals like zoning amendments, official plan amendments, those types of things. But then, building permits, and then also negotiating and drafting construction contracts. And that can be, specific bespoke forms that clients want us to help them prepare or negotiate, or using standard industry forms like the CCDC forms or other ones like the OAA or RAICs. So working all the time as well in helping our clients manage issues that come up in the project, I think with a real focus on avoiding disputes, trying to, help projects be as successful as possible to come in on time, on budget, which is what we all want. Really trying to make the legal elements of that dispute avoidance, risk management, risk avoidance tool for everyone in the pyramid, whether it's owners, contractors, trades, engineers, architects.
Okay, so looks like you might have been really busy just doing a lot of contracts that are related to stuff that we do. And I'm a very, very lay person in terms of contracts, although a lot of my family is from the law background. The only thing I know about lawyers is that if you get in trouble, they're the first people you should contact.
Well, and that's where, I guess what I would recommend is that you call us long before you get in trouble so that we can help you avoid getting in trouble. A good contract is a roadmap for your project. It lays out how you're going to manage and how you're going to communicate with each other, how you're going to deal with issues that we know will likely come up or that often come up, like, unknown site conditions or changes to applicable laws, which we saw happen during the pandemic, force majeure events like things like a pandemic pandemic. If we think about these things, talk about them at the outset, then we really get to know, who we're going into this project with. But it also gives us, confidence about how we're going to handle these problems so that when they do arise, we have an understanding of how we're going to deal with them in the hopes that we don't need to fight about them later.
Right.
I think a big problem can be when everyone just spits in a handshake, assumes everything's going to go fine, and then that unexpected thing happens, or that thing everyone was hoping wouldn't happen occurs, and now everyone's pointing fingers at everyone and trying to deal with it at the back end, which is often much more costly and time consuming for everyone involved, not good for the project. So definitely, I know lawyers aren't everyone's favorite people, but trying to encourage everyone in the industry to talk to us early, help us help you make the project go smoothly, and avoid needing us later on at the back end.
Yeah, it's like an old saying, a stitch in time saves a nine later. That's great. And talking about contracts and languages, we've talked about this a lot with the whole, and this is a BIM focused podcast. How has, first of all, do you see a lot of BIM stuff, BIM related language being increasingly used in contracts these days?
To be honest, I'm surprised by how little I see it addressed in contracts. I will see, ownership of deliverables, which will often be very broadly defined, being addressed in contracts, where we'll say, deliverables is anything, a model, a report, a plan that you produce in the course of performing the work, or the services if we're dealing with an architect. And often owners under these contracts just say, and I own all of that, that's mine. Alternatively, and what we often are usually encourage is more of a licensing approach, because ownership isn't strictly needed in order to get the project done and to do your operation, maintenance, repairs in the future. You don't need to own the design or own the BIM model in order to do that. You just need the right license rights in order to use it. But that's not always the route that owners want to go. But, we'll see terms to address ownership, licensing of deliverables broadly in that sense. And while I'm familiar with and see occasionally more detailed terms added to deal with BIM, like the IBC template form, where we'd say, here's the protocol for how we're going to deal with BIM. Here's how, we're going to deal with ownership and contribution to that model, reliance on that model, who can rely on it or use it for what. Those are the types of terms we would see added into a contract or addressed in a contract when BIM is being used. But I am surprised by how little I actually see that addressed specifically in contracts, even though forms like the IBC one have been out there for a very long time. Although I am hoping that as BIM starts getting used more often, I know organizations like the Ontario General Contractors Association are working very hard to increase uptake of this technology in our industry. And so I think, correlating with that should be a greater focus on making sure that the use of this is properly addressed at the outset of your project and in your contract, so that if later on you're using BIM and no one's turned their minds to what can it be used for, who can rely on it, how do we track who is making changes to it or who can make changes to it, well, then you could find yourself later on having a big fight about it and not being clear as to how those responsibilities and liabilities are being allocated.
Okay, this is one thing I want to add from my side. BIM is clearly being used in one form or the other on projects, whether it's used through some software, whether it's used by a process, whether it's used by extracting the data that we needed. And I don't know if people know this, but with every piece of information that gets out of, like, you use a software for convenience purposes, right? That so-and-so software will make your drawings look better, or it would automate some of your stuff. And I've myself seen some, like, not the whole contract, but parts of contracts where they say that so-and-so model needs to be of a certain detail level. Well, that's another discussion in itself, but a certain detail level, which is not even the scope of that consultant. But because the consultant signed on that, not knowing that they needed to do it, or it was even like in their power to do that. Say for example, a mechanical engineer, they just need to design the mechanical system, but it's up to the trade to see where the hangers would go, or where, that's something that a certain detail level mechanical engineer cannot do and should not do, because they're not actually manufacturing the whole stuff, right? But they do sign off sometimes on a project, on a contract, where they say that we need to deliver to a certain detail level for this. And then they do get trouble with the client, they get sued, and then, stuff like that comes into play. Like, then have to contact Annik and ask Annik what we can do about it now. So talking about the contract language, are there any particular terms that if a consultant, a contractor, a trade, or even an owner, they're asking for a BIM deliverable, are there specific terms or specific clauses that they should be thinking about, or specific conditions they should be thinking about when they're signing a contract or when they're asking for something?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit on it a little bit already, but I think the key things when we're talking about a BIM model and the use of it, whether you're being asked to produce it or you're asking someone to provide it to you, or even if it's just to contribute to that model, I think the first thing is that copyright, licensing, ownership question. Like that's one of the first things that you want to think about. Like the IBC contract form contemplates that each model element is owned by the person who puts it in. And then that person represents that there is no copyright infringement. There are no intellectual property issues with them putting that in. So, because you don't want a third party coming in and suing, and later, the owner, the contractor is saying, whoa, what are you talking about, trade contractor or consultant? I asked you to put this in and now I'm getting sued because of copyright infringement. Now, how often does that actually happen? I'm not aware of any specific cases, but I think that first issue of the copyright and licensing, question is kind of one of the key things to be addressed. The next thing is, what can it be used for? Like, are we just using this for clash detection, or are we using it, to inform or basically be part of the construction documents that everyone is actually using to build it on site? Or is it just running things to help, with that clash detection between the different plans and drawings? Is it being used for the entire building or just this room that we're able to use it for that? Just what are the permitted uses? And then to what extent can people rely on it? And this is a tricky issue because, again, the default in the contracts, particularly when we're talking, from the owner's perspective, which then just usually gets flowed through, is the owner will say, you can't rely on anything that you're getting from me. And that often includes anything that's coming from the consultant that the owner has hired directly. And so if the BIM model is coming from the consultant, then often in the contract, it might say, contractor, you can't rely on this. Well, that's a problematic contract term, just BIM or not, for the contractor, because they're saying, I'm not the designer. I'm not here to double check or verify all of the designer's work. But when you get into something as complicated as BIM with all kinds of different inputs, if people can't rely on that, at least to a certain extent, it can really inhibit their ability to use it in its, to its full capability without that fear of risk. Because I think, and that's where I see as an unfortunate barrier to this, is just the nature and in the way that we've been allocating risk in this industry, which is very, push it all down the chain. And, that combined with a, low bid procurement process pushes people to it pushes a lot of this risk for errors in design onto the contractor, or at least puts them at risk of having a protracted, costly dispute with an uncertain outcome with the consultant later on, because, an error in the design or maybe in the BIM model resulted in something being constructed incorrectly. And now the cost of correcting it is exponentially higher than it would have been if we had caught it at the design stage.
Right.
And so this is where, the CDAO report that was issued about a month or two ago now, it concluded that we need more time up front for design, so that it can be well thought out, so that it's not rushed, so that there's more money put in at the front end to prevent those problems later on at the back end. And that is exactly the same thing with BIM. We need more investment, we need more time to do it properly, because when we actually use it to its full potential, then we can minimize those more costly issues that might arise later on that are more costly to address. But I see that, that that risk allocation that pushes everything down often has, in particular, the consultant and the contractor fighting each other, saying, no, this wasn't my responsibility, it was the designer. And the designer saying, no, this wasn't my responsibility, it was the contractor. And the owner saying, well, I know it's just not me, it's got to be one of you two. And that environment, risk of blame, I think creates a lot of apprehension and concern with using something as collaborative as BIM, because you're not sure when you do go to use it, if something does go wrong, well, what's my exposure here? Does it put me in, does it increase the likelihood of me finding myself in that kind of a dispute with another one of the project parties where I could be left holding the bag? And so, I'm hoping that that we can find ways to change that attitude in the industry. And that's where things like IPD and more collaborative contracting and things like that, I think are helpful in getting us in the right direction to use tools like this better, because I don't think it's like we can deal with these things in contracts. We have the contract language for it, but I think it's this culture of risk allocation and blame and dispute that can be so pervasive in our industry that makes people apprehensive about it, that I'm hoping we can get out of our own way in that respect.
Okay. Well, you've unpacked a lot of things in last
I realized I'm probably going on for a little too long there.
Yeah, I was listening and it is so engaging. And I'm telling you, this is the talk I want to have on this podcast, that, we are discussing about all these amazing technologies, and you can use artificial intelligence to do amazing stuff on buildings, do building performance analysis and all the great things that technology is capable of. But what it starts with is everybody being on the same page of at least working towards a collaborative environment, and not just, like you said, pointing fingers to each other. And I do want to touch on IPD, but before that, I know you touched a little bit upon this, but copyright, licensing, these are some of the risks both consultants and contractors they're exposed to. And I'll be very honest, I worked with both of them, and both of them, like you said, when we don't have enough time, we don't create the content that we need to put inside our models ourselves. We download, we borrow, we use from a prior project. So we do all of that. And that does create a liability issue, because sometimes it does feel that you don't have to recreate the wheel. You already have a piece of content, a piece of detail, a piece of how two things are joining together. It's exactly the same detail, and we can copy paste it. But then there have been stuff that has created issues. And in fact, once I was on this committee in IBI where we would analyze that why did we get sued, or that why did we get a notice, or why did this thing happen. And what I realized is a lot of time it's the lack of time, that we didn't have enough time to design stuff or to vet or do the peer reviews, or and it's sometimes it's a very bullish situation outside, that it's cutthroat competition, and it's this run for making the lowest fee for your work and stuff like that. And it just does push everybody in that space where and everybody wants to make money, everybody wants to take some money home and make their livelihoods. So everything is understood, but particularly if we have to talk about, let's say, contractors and trades, are there any particular risks they get exposed to when they have to use a consultant's model, and vice versa, when consultants share their models with contractors? Other than the issues that you discussed, are there any particular let's say data and stuff like that? Do they get exposed to risks like that?
So I think, again, an interesting question is, okay, so there's the risk that we just talked about, which is the licensing, the ownership. What can you use it for? Can you rely on it? What if there's a mistake in it? Who's responsible for it? And can we end up in a big fight about that? I think that is really the biggest risk that both sides are exposed to in that respect. I mean, of course, the contract could add on to that if you have really broad, indemnities or other things in there. Depending on the contract, they can increase or exacerbate those risks.
Mm-hmm.
But I think another question that I, again, don't really see addressed very often in construction contracts is this question of data, which goes beyond just, I have this model is showing me this structure in this building, but it's also providing you with a lot of other information about how we work, timing, schedule, cost. Like there's all kinds of information that gets downloaded into this that has value outside of just the project itself and the immediate, construction of this building.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is something that I think when you look at if a software developer, for example, like a Google or an Apple, when they send you contract, they have, detailed terms about data and its collection, where it gets stored, how it can be used, who owns that data. Whereas in construction, although this data, especially the more we implement technologies like BIM, is being collected and clearly being stored somewhere, we're not really turning our minds to those questions actively, like other than I think the CCDC 30, the IPD contract, which has a Schedule F that is contemplated for a BIM protocol or terms relating to BIM. The other CCDC forms don't turn their minds to data, to ownership or licensing of these deliverables. The CCDC2, the most commonly used stipulated, fixed price contract between an owner and a contractor, doesn't talk about these issues at all. So if you want it in there, you need to do that through supplementary conditions. And I think that broader data question and what risks come along with that, I'm not sure. Like, are you getting information about my business, my trade secrets? Is any of that being divulged as I put in my model element, or as we all contribute to this? I'm not sure to what extent that could also be the case, that the exposure is beyond the immediate, disputes between the project parties and the costs of delays associated with that project. But that broader data sharing and the implications of that, I think is a very interesting and important question that I'm not sure we've really as an industry turned our minds to fully.
Okay, well, at least I think there are people who've started asking those questions. We're addressing it on platforms like this and building transformations, and so I think we've started some discussion around it. And since we've talked about IPD a couple of times, first of all, what is IPD? And we do have a podcast that is totally dedicated to IPD. In this podcast, this is a shout out to Geza, who's going to be in that podcast and is going to discuss everything that anybody would have any questions about IPD who's not worked on an IPD project. But what is broadly, if you have to say, an IPD contract, and is it a solution for all the project related issues, especially involving BIM?
So integrated project delivery, IPD, is a collaborative approach or collaborative project delivery model for construction projects. And it's typically used for very complex, large projects. And it does away entirely with our more traditional delivery models like design bid build or design build or construction manager at risk or construction manager not at risk, which all have kind of like chains, like trees of contracts, owner to the design builder to all of the trades and the consultant, or owner with the consultant and owner with the contractor, two separate contracts. The IPD model contemplates one big contract with everyone involved in the same thing. So it's a multi-party contract, which is unique just in that sense, but it encourages, and just even expressly, if you look at the CCDC 30, which is the CCDC form of IPD contract, although there are other collaborative, like alliance contracting and other kind of different versions of collaborative models of contracting. But the idea in the IPD is it expressly says you're all going to work together. You're going to collaborate. You're going to create a culture of mutual respect and trust. These are fundamental to the success of this delivery model. And the nice thing about that, and so then it makes everyone, the risk and reward is shared by everyone based on their proportionate interest. And so if there's something wrong in the design, everyone has an interest in catching it early, in resolving it, and collaborating and working together to manage it as time and cost effectively as possible, as opposed to potentially, in our more traditional models, the contractor washing their hands of it and saying, that's a design issue, that's not mine. Here's a change order. You're going to need to pay me this much more, and you're going to need to extend my schedule by this much. And then the consultant saying, no, that's not a design error. That's, that was part of their scope. They should have seen that. And so it's the contractor's problem. And in an IPD model, you're all in the same boat together. You need to bail it out collaboratively. And so it really encourages that collaboration, especially or including at the front end. Although I do think that, in all of our projects, we can always just benefit from more time and investment at that front end. But I think that then takes, like, the risks we were just talking about, that potential, finger pointing and being blamed for a mistake in the model, or having being like wearing that error or the costs resulting from it later on, holding the bag for it, that comes off the table because you're all in this together. You're all sharing that risk. And so I think it creates an environment and a culture that is much more conducive to using BIM and to having it adopted and really used to its full potential, as we would hope.
Okay. And like I said, we will have everybody listening to this podcast, we will have one whole episode by the person who created the language of IPD contracts. Yes. And
he's the godfather of IPD. Will do a much better job of explaining it than the Coles Notes version I just provided. But I think the key for our conversation is just models like this, or when you organize your project and structure your culture on a project in a way that is not shifting risk or pushing risk onto the parties in a way where they're concerned about being, blamed or holding liability and risk because of problems with the model. That is what's needed to better facilitate its uptake and its use. And I think just generally to avoid the costs and delays that we see so prevalent in our construction industry.
And you know what? Listening to you, I think I need to go through the CCDC 30 and do more research on IPD myself before I do the next week's podcast. Now you're making me really nervous about it.
Well, I will send it to you. And, the CCDC 30, it really is a completely different animal from any of the other contracts. Just the entire approach that it takes is completely different. And, so hats off to Geza and his peers in the industry who, helped bring this to life, because I really do think that there's so much potential for what we can do when we work together in that kind of way and, move out of our more traditional way of thinking, which has clearly not been driving us to the right place.
Yeah. And I think everybody can make more money, save more money. Like if there are people who out there who just care about how much money they want to make on a project, clearly IPD or not IPD, just having an open dialogue and having more collaboration or more just an interest that let's work together in that direction just saves more money. Everybody can make more money. Everybody can be more productive. So I think we will move to the next section. This is the most awaited section of this podcast. See, you're right now I'm a kid in the room and I'm asking the questions which are very with very limited understanding of contract, construction law and everything. But now I'm going to ask you a question where I know you won't know the answers of.
Yeah, I'm not feeling optimistic from the other questions I've heard asked on your other podcasts, but we'll see. At least it's multiple choice, right?
Yes.
25% chance of getting it right.
Yes. So, and I will ask you 3 questions and we will see how much can you guess. And these are also sometimes, I know you might not know these answers and everything might be just a guesswork, but who knows, you might have just come across something in one of your contracts about this. So you never know. Yes. So let's move to the impossible questionnaire. So my first question is, according to the Building Code Act, the authority to issue a change certificate lies with the registered code agency, chief building official, director of building and development branch of Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, or senior plans examiner or senior building inspector of the authority.
What was being issued again?
Authority to issue a change certificate.
A change certificate. The chief building official.
No, the registered code agency. Okay, let's do a more construction stuff. Let's see. Well, I have a question right in front of me that I'm not going to ask. What is CCDC 14? I am not going to ask that because I know you might be knowing.
I know that one. It's a design
That's what I'm
build.
saying. That's what I'm saying. Okay, this is like a science question, which also we sometimes use in our building construction while designing. But what is the interior surface or the curve of an arch known as? So, the interior side of the arch.
Okay.
What is it known as? It is known as concave, convex, intrados, extrados.
Concave?
Of an arch.
Oh, of an arch. So then one of the other two. What were the last two?
Concave, convex, intrados, and extrados.
Intrados.
See, you got one correct.
Yeah, only after I said concave and you clarified the question, but I'll take it.
You take it. You should take it.
I will.
Okay, so the last question. So, there are different kind of welds and welding systems in buildings, right? So I'm going to ask you, what is a fillet weld called? Like a more formal name for a fillet weld? A convex weld, a miter weld, a concave weld, or all of them?
All of them.
You are so smart. No kidding, you're a lawyer.
Was that right?
You're right. By the way, you scored more than average. You know that, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's move to the last part of this. Well, what do you feel about the questions, first of all?
Oh, I thought they were fun. I'm disappointed I didn't get the building code one because I work with the building code, and so I'm frustrated by that. But no, I think they're fun.
Okay, so the last part is the rosebud and thorn section. And this section, it's kind of the summary of the whole podcast, but also if there is something that we didn't touch upon in our discussion. So what would be your rosebud and thorn? And it's entirely like based on your experience of getting BIM and BIM related language involved in a project. So rose being the benefit of today, bud, something that you see that, that's going to be, if you don't see the benefit today, but tomorrow this is going to be good. And then a thorn, which is like a challenge or a side effect. So rosebud and thorn of involving BIM and BIM related language on a project contract.
So I think the rose is part of what we talked about, which is getting that roadmap set out at the early stages or at the outset of the project for how you're going to use BIM so that everyone is on the same page. So I think that's a good thing about addressing it in your contracts. I think it's pragmatic and it sets you up to avoid a dispute or confusion later on, which can cause added costs or delays, which we all want to avoid. I think the bud is that, when done right and maybe again, chicken or an egg, but like that BIM can be a big part of helping encourage better collaboration and better teamwork on our projects. That is what's essential to a successful project, is working together. A contractor can't do it on their own. A consultant can't do it on their own. The owner can't do it on their own. We all need each other in order to build the incredible things that we're able to do. And so, if BIM can be a part of helping encourage that culture and kind of be a really cool way of showing the fruits of our collaboration, I think that would be a bud. And I think the thorn is, again, kind of what we talked about, which is that apprehension. Like no one wants to deal with the contracts. No one wants to deal with the lawyers. And, it's seen as, we're not here to go through a 50-page document. That's not what we entered into this business for. And so I see that as kind of the side effect is, yes, like it does require thinking about these things and taking the time at the beginning to do it, which can be pain and an irritant and, something that you'd rather just kick down the road. But I think something something that prudent and a good thing. But I would say that's the thorn, is that it's, not what everyone wants to be doing, is dealing with the lawyers and the contracts. But hopefully, we can help facilitate the project success as opposed to getting in its way, which, I definitely think that sometimes, the lawyers, we're always thinking about what can go wrong. And that's often because that's also what we see, right? Like you said at the outset, Chetna, people call us when something goes wrong. And so, we can often be like, well, what about this? And what about that? And I think we have to try our best to also not, get in the way of being overly pessimistic about the risks, so that we can help, find a pragmatic solution to it that's not, getting in our own way as well.
Right. And I think, and while you were talking, and I love to put comparisons or analogies to, when somebody's talking, it's more like when you start a project, it's like giving birth to a baby. You prepare for it, and, when the baby's out there, then you go into the operations and maintenance of that child. So like, I always joke about it that most parents would say like your child is like a minimum 18-year project. If you're lucky, it's 18-year. But sometimes some projects go on for 30 years into operations and maintenance. So
just imagining parents negotiating a change order and
I wish I could have a change.
There's been a change site condition on this baby.
Right. But I think talking to a lawyer before getting into a contract is more like attending a prenatal class where you know what to expect. Do you think anything can go wrong even after that? For sure it can, right? At least you know the unknowns. There are always the unknowns in every situation. But it's like, so just like, when everybody's saying all these, when everybody's not liking the lawyers, I would say going to a lawyer before a project and, looking through your contract is as important as going to a prenatal classes. And not just the mom has to go, the mom and the dad, and maybe even sometimes grandparents should go to prenatal classes, because when they raised their kids, it was a different time, right? So I think that's a more softer way of looking at it and more friendly way to look at it. Everybody loves babies and kids. So
yes, no, absolutely. I agree. It's taking the time to prepare as best as you can. Like you said, like you can't contemplate or prepare for every eventuality. You also can't, if the person that you've entered into a project or a contract with wants to make your life miserable, they can, no matter what the contract says, right?
Yes.
But at least if you've turned your mind to the things that you can anticipate or that are more likely to occur, and create a roadmap for how you're going to handle them, you set yourself up as best as possible for success. And hopefully, again, like we said, like we're always trying to avoid those disputes. So if we've already turned our minds to the problem and how we're going to work together to solve it, and set the tone for our relationship, like that's really what the contract is doing too. And the negotiation is setting the tone for how we're going to work together.
Right.
If you put in a proposed BIM protocol and it gets thrown out by the other side, well, now you have a bit of an understanding of who you're getting into business with,
right.
which, can give you some very important information about how you want to handle things going forward. So it's I think definitely a very prudent thing to do, just like a prenatal class. And like you said, like everyone should be involved. It's not something that, just one parent or one party could use or benefit from over another.
Right. But I was really thinking that how this podcast is going to go. But you know what? Not even for 1 second, I felt that I'm talking about things that I don't know anything about. So thank you so much for making this sound so easy and bite-sized for everybody. Thank you so much from me, from everybody who's listening to the BIM Student Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun. I'm looking at the time. I can't believe how quickly it's blown by.
Right. Thank you so much, Annik. Bye-bye.
Thank you.